I'm glad you've taken the time to hear this story. Before we get into the details, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below. The early morning sun cast a golden glow over the airport tarmac, signaling another busy day of departures and arrivals. Among the sea of travelers moving through the bustling terminal stood Nathan Cole, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a presence that exuded both confidence and discipline. Carrying his pilot's cap tucked under his arm, Nathan walked with the steady composure of someone used to command. His crisp white uniform shirt, adorned with golden stripes on the shoulders, paired with neatly pressed black trousers and polished shoes, left no doubt about his rank. A man dressed like this should never have to justify his place. And yet, today, he would. Nathan was scheduled to captain a long-haul flight later that evening, but for now, he was traveling as a passenger, something common for pilots repositioning between assignments. His airline had booked him a first-class seat so he could rest before the long journey ahead. Adjusting his cap slightly, he reflected on what it meant to wear the uniform. It was more than just a job. It was the realization of a lifelong dream. As a child in South Carolina, he had stood by a chain-link fence at a small regional airport, mesmerized by the planes taking off. His father, an aircraft mechanic, had taught him to respect both the beauty and complexity of flight. Years later, Nathan had turned that childhood fascination into a career, defying every obstacle along the way. But even as he had soared to new heights, he found that prejudice still lingered in the skies. As he approached the check-in counter, a subtle but undeniable tension filled the air. One of the flight attendants behind the desk, her name tag reading Jessica Morrow, glanced his way. Her eyes flickered over his uniform, her lips tightening into a frown. Her posture stiffened as she turned away, suddenly preoccupied with the passenger ahead of him. Nathan had encountered all kinds of airline staff throughout his career, some warm and welcoming, others indifferent or even dismissive. But something about Jessica's demeanor set off a quiet warning inside him. Years in the cockpit had trained him to notice even the smallest signs of trouble before they escalated. When it was finally his turn, he stepped forward and offered a polite nod. "Good morning. I'm on flight 739 to Chicago. I'm a pilot repositioning for an international flight tonight." Jessica's lips pressed into a thin line. "Name?" "Nathan Cole." Without making eye contact, she entered his information into the system. After a moment of silence, her gaze lifted, cold and unreadable. "You're assigned to seat 1A. That's in first class. Are you aware of that?" Nathan remained composed. "Yes, I'm aware. My airline booked the seat for me so I could rest before my next flight." Jessica's expression darkened slightly. It was a look he had seen before, a mix of skepticism and something harder to define. "We don't usually let employees just take first-class seats unless there's a special arrangement. Do you have any confirmation of this?" Nathan slid his documents across the counter, including a letter of authorization from his airline. "Everything is here. This is standard procedure for repositioning pilots." Jessica took the papers, flipping through them with a dismissive air. A few feet away, another flight attendant, Margaret Davis, an older woman with kind eyes, glanced over. She had been helping another passenger but had clearly overheard part of the exchange. Her expression held a trace of concern. Jessica handed the documents back with a shake of her head. "I'm afraid we can't honor this. You'll have to sit in economy. If you want to stay in first class, you'll need to pay the fare difference." A tight knot formed in Nathan's stomach. He remained calm, reaching into his pocket and presenting his official ID. "With all due respect, I don't need to pay anything. My airline already covered the cost." Jessica barely glanced at the ID, her expression unchanging. "And which airline is that again?" he told her, watching as she tapped her nails on the desk, as if the entire situation was an inconvenience to her. "I've never heard of them giving first-class seats to pilots unless they're high-level executives. Are you sure you haven't mixed up your seat assignment?" Nathan inhaled slowly, controlling the rising frustration inside him. "There's no mistake. Everything is in order." Jessica exhaled sharply and turned to a coworker, Mark, a younger man busy sorting luggage tags. Loud enough for others to hear, she said, "We have a commuter claiming a first-class seat. I'm going to need some backup here." Nathan felt the anger surge within him, but years of experience had taught him one thing: when people expected a reaction, the best move was to stay composed. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "I am not a random commuter. I am a pilot on duty, traveling under an official agreement." Jessica scoffed. "I'll be the judge of that." Margaret, who had been watching silently, finally stepped in. Her voice was gentle but firm. "Jessica, perhaps we should double-check his documentation or call a supervisor before making any decisions." Jessica waved her off. "I don't need a supervisor for this. I know how seat allocations work." Nathan carefully placed his documents back on the counter, his patience wearing thin. "Everything you need is here, including an email confirmation from my airline. If you take a moment to verify it, you'll see there's no issue." Jessica snatched up the papers again, flipping through them unnecessarily before pushing them back. "This doesn't sit right with me. I don't feel comfortable upgrading you. You're not sitting in first class on my watch." A hush fell over the passengers behind him. Some looked on with quiet sympathy, others with annoyance at the delay. Nathan clenched his jaw. This wasn't just about a seat. This was about something far more insidious. Still, he refused to lose his composure. "I'll wait for the supervisor," he said, his voice steady, "but I'm not giving up my seat without cause." Jessica's expression hardened. "Fine, step aside and I'll see if the supervisor has time to deal with you." Nathan took a slow breath and moved to the side as Margaret cast him an apologetic glance. She knew what was happening, and from the looks of the passengers in line, so did they. As the minutes ticked by, he watched Jessica continue checking in other travelers without issue. She occasionally glanced at him, making it clear she had no intention of resolving the matter quickly. Nathan didn't budge. He had faced adversity before. He had worked too hard, come too far, to let someone like her make him feel like he didn't belong. And soon, he would make a call that would change everything. Jessica didn't bother lowering her voice. Instead, she turned to her coworker and spoke as though Nathan wasn't even standing there. "We've got someone here claiming a first-class seat. I'm going to need some backup." Nathan felt a flicker of anger rise, but he kept his expression neutral. Over the years, he had learned that reacting emotionally would only confirm the biases of those looking for a reason to doubt him. "There's no need for backup, ma'am," he said calmly. "I'm a pilot, traveling under an official arrangement. I'm not some random commuter trying to sneak into first class." Jessica's lip curled slightly. "I'll be the one to decide that." A few feet away, Margaret, the older flight attendant who had been listening to the exchange, cleared her throat softly. "Jessica, maybe we should check his paperwork again, or call a supervisor to verify." Jessica waved off the suggestion, irritation flashing across her face. "I don't need a supervisor. I know exactly how these seat assignments work." Nathan, maintaining his composure, placed his documents back on the counter, this time including the email confirmation from his airline, the official travel itinerary, and his assigned seat information. "Everything is here," he said, keeping his voice steady. Jessica snatched up the documents, flipping through them with exaggerated impatience. She rolled her eyes and shoved them back toward him. "This looks questionable, and I don't feel comfortable upgrading you. You're not sitting in first class on my watch." Margaret's voice softened, but there was an edge of urgency in her tone. "Let's take a step back and talk this through. There's a line forming." Indeed, a small crowd had gathered behind Nathan. Some passengers watched with quiet curiosity, while others seemed visibly annoyed at the delay. A few whispered among themselves, clearly aware that something wasn't right. Nathan could feel the weight of their eyes on him, but he refused to let it shake him. Leaning in slightly, he lowered his voice. "Ma'am, I'm sorry you feel uncomfortable, but I have followed every procedure correctly. This seat was booked for me. Please take another look." Jessica lifted her chin in defiance. "I don't care what your story is. You can go sit in economy. Take it or leave it." A hush settled over the group of waiting passengers. The implication in Jessica's words was unmistakable. Nathan had dealt with discrimination before, but rarely had someone been so blatant about it in front of a crowd. For a brief moment, memories of flight school resurfaced. How some instructors had doubted his capabilities, attributing his success to lowered standards rather than his own hard work. He had passed every test, logged countless hours in the air, and proven himself time and time again. Yet here he was, still being challenged, still being questioned. Taking a measured breath, he made his decision. "I'll wait for the supervisor," he said firmly, "but I'm not giving up my seat without a valid reason." Jessica's face turned to stone. "Fine. Stand over there. I'll see if the supervisor has time for this." Nathan stepped aside, feeling Margaret's apologetic gaze follow him. She clearly disagreed with Jessica but didn't have the authority to override her. He gave her a small, reassuring nod, silently acknowledging her concern. The line moved forward, travelers checking in without issue. Jessica continued her work as if nothing had happened, making sure to avoid looking in Nathan's direction. Meanwhile, Margaret assisted an elderly couple, treating them with warmth and patience, the kind of professionalism Jessica seemed to lack entirely. Minutes passed. Then at last the shift supervisor arrived. A stocky man with a receding hairline. Greg Dawson walked up to the counter with a frown, glancing between Jessica and Nathan as though already suspecting trouble. Jessica immediately leaned in, lowering her voice as she spoke to him. But from the corner of his eye, Nathan could see the way she gestured in his direction, her body language telling its own story. She was framing the situation exactly as she wanted it to be seen. Greg sighed before stepping around the counter and approaching Nathan. "Can you explain the situation?" he asked, his tone more neutral than Jessica's had been. Nathan kept it professional, repeating the key facts: the booked first-class seat, the official documentation, the reason for his travel. He handed over his paperwork once more. Greg listened without interrupting, occasionally casting a glance at Jessica, as if gauging how far he should back her up. Finally, he took the documents and studied them carefully. After a long pause, he nodded. "These all check out. I don't see any issue here. If the seat was arranged by his airline, there's no reason to deny it." Jessica bristled, cutting in sharply. "I told you it's suspicious. Since when do commuter pilots get first-class seats on our airline? He doesn't even work for us." Greg let out a slow breath, clearly trying to remain patient. "Jessica, we have interline agreements. You know that. If his airline booked the seat, it's honored. That's standard policy." Jessica's expression hardened, but she didn't argue further. Greg turned back to Nathan. "I'll print you a fresh boarding pass with your confirmed seat. Did you check any luggage?" "No, just a carry-on." Greg nodded and entered the details into the system. A moment later, the printer whirred, and he handed Nathan a fresh boarding pass. "Seat 1A, unchanged. Apologies for the inconvenience, Captain Cole. Enjoy your flight." Nathan took the pass, feeling a surge of relief. But he wasn't naive enough to think the issue was over. Jessica still hadn't backed down, and her expression made it clear that she wasn't finished with him. For now, though, Nathan simply gave a polite nod. "Thank you." As he turned and walked away from the counter, he could still feel Jessica's cold gaze burning into his back. Something told him that this wasn't the last time she'd try to undermine him. And if he was right, this flight was about to get even more uncomfortable. Greg exhaled, rubbing his temple before turning back to Nathan. "If his airline paid for a seat on ours, it's standard policy to honor it. I don't see any issue here." Jessica's eyes narrowed, her expression unreadable, but clearly hostile. "It just doesn't feel right," she muttered. Greg sighed, clearly done with the conversation. He turned to Nathan. "Let me print you a fresh boarding pass, just so there's no further confusion. Did you check any luggage?" "No, just a carry-on. I travel light," Nathan replied. Greg nodded and quickly typed into the system. A soft whir from the printer followed, and within seconds, he handed Nathan a crisp new boarding pass. The seat assignment remained the same, 1A, first class. With a tight professional smile, Greg said, "Apologies for the inconvenience. Enjoy your flight." Nathan accepted the pass, relieved that someone had finally handled the situation professionally. But as he turned to leave, he could feel Jessica's cold stare burning into his back. This wasn't over. He had encountered people like her before, people who refused to accept being proven wrong. They didn't let things slide. They looked for ways to retaliate. Nathan took a slow breath and walked away from the counter, eager to put some distance between himself and the negativity. Weaving through the airport crowd, he let the familiar hum of overhead announcements and the rolling of suitcases ground him. Security was uneventful. The TSA agent scanned his documents, made small talk about his uniform, and waved him through without issue. None of them suspected that, just minutes ago, he had been questioned like an imposter at the check-in desk. But as he reached his departure gate, Nathan's stomach sank. Jessica was there. For a moment, he had hoped she was just ground staff and wouldn't be on the flight. But there she was, standing with the rest of the crew, chatting with Mark, the younger airline employee from earlier. Nathan slowed his pace, lingering near a row of seats. He could hear bits of their conversation. Jessica's voice carried a sharp edge. Ridiculous. I don't care what the supervisor said, he doesn't belong there. Mark chuckled lightly, but didn't seem fully invested. They hadn't noticed Nathan yet. He turned slightly, glancing out the large airport windows. The plane sat at the jet bridge, its sleek exterior gleaming in the morning sun. The atmosphere was like any other boarding area. Business travelers typing on laptops, families corralling their kids, flight attendants preparing for departure. But for Nathan, there was an undercurrent of tension. He reminded himself to stay professional. Even when off duty, a pilot had to maintain composure. There were lines that shouldn't be crossed, and denying a passenger, especially a repositioning pilot, with legitimate documents was a serious offense. Yet here he was, fighting to be treated fairly. His mind wandered briefly to the conversation he would have to have with his airline later. If this unnecessary confrontation drained him too much, he might not be in peak condition for his long-haul flight that evening. His airline would have to scramble for a replacement, and the thought of letting his team down weighed on him. He stared at his reflection in the glass window. His face was calm, but his eyes carried the burden of experience. The kind of exhaustion that came from fighting the same battle over and over again. How many more times would he have to prove himself? When the first boarding announcement rang through the speakers, Nathan stayed seated, waiting until first class was called. He had no desire to cause a scene. He just wanted to get on the plane quietly, take his seat, and move on. But as he approached the gate, Jessica was the one scanning tickets. Nathan gave her a polite nod, hoping for some level of professionalism. She just stared at him, as if he were something unpleasant she had to tolerate. Boarding pass. Her tone was clipped, businesslike, but edged with resentment. Nathan handed it over without a word. She scanned it, glanced at the name, then looked up at him. For a moment, he thought she might actually tear the pass in half with the way her hand tensed. But instead, she handed it back, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Enjoy your flight. Nathan took the pass and walked past her without a reaction. Inside the jet bridge, he exhaled slowly, centering himself. He would not let her get under his skin. Stepping onto the aircraft, he quickly found seat 1A, a plush leather chair near the window. Plenty of legroom. Quiet. He stowed his bag in the overhead compartment and sank into the seat, appreciating the comfort. For a brief moment, he considered ordering a drink before takeoff, but he quickly dismissed the thought. The last thing he needed was any excuse for Jessica to further scrutinize him. Water. Maybe coffee later. Keep it simple. As other first-class passengers filtered in, Nathan felt a few curious glances. An older gentleman in a tweed jacket gave him a polite nod, seemingly unbothered by his presence. A young woman in business attire offered a small smile. Nathan returned the gesture, hoping this flight would proceed without further tension. But as he buckled his seatbelt and watched the flight attendants prepare for takeoff, he had a sinking feeling. Jessica wasn't finished with him yet. And the flight had only just begun. As the flight crew prepared the cabin, Margaret and Mark worked with quiet efficiency, ensuring everything was in place before takeoff. Meanwhile, Jessica hovered in the background, her gaze flicking toward Nathan every so often. It wasn't just a glance, it was a deliberate, watchful stare, the kind that made it clear she wasn't done making things difficult for him. At one point, Margaret approached Nathan's seat, offering a warm smile. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Cole. Can I get you anything before takeoff?" Nathan hesitated, glancing around briefly. "Just water, please." Margaret nodded, her tone reassuring. "Certainly." She returned moments later with a small bottle and a cup of ice, setting it on his tray table with a quiet, "Enjoy." Nathan murmured his thanks, appreciating the small act of kindness. It was a stark contrast to Jessica's outright hostility. He wondered how two people with such different outlooks on professionalism and respect could even be colleagues. As the plane pushed back from the gate, Nathan felt the familiar hum of the engines, the power thrumming beneath the floor as they prepared for takeoff. Normally, he loved this part. The anticipation, the sense of movement, the controlled precision of it all. Even when he wasn't in the cockpit, there was something exhilarating about watching the world shrink below. But the tension from the gate still lingered. He kept his guard up, sensing that Jessica wasn't finished with him yet. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Jessica made her way down the aisle, performing the final compliance check. She stopped abruptly at Nathan's row. Her voice was loud enough for the passenger across the aisle to hear. "Seatbelt on?" Nathan calmly lifted the edge of his jacket, revealing the securely fastened belt. "Yes." Jessica gave a tight nod and moved on. Nathan exhaled slowly. He wasn't about to let her provoke him. Moments later, the engines roared, and the aircraft surged forward, lifting into the sky. Once the seatbelt sign clicked off, the cabin crew sprang into action. Mark disappeared behind the curtain, likely preparing beverages, while Margaret moved through first class, distributing hot towels with graceful efficiency. Jessica, on the other hand, lingered in the galley, watching Nathan with that same scrutinizing look. Then, as if she had made up her mind about something, she approached his seat. Nathan sensed her presence before she spoke. "Sir," she said, her voice tinged with forced politeness. "May I see your ticket again?" Nathan raised a brow. "You already scanned it at the door." Jessica's smile was tight, artificial. "I'd like to verify something with your name and seat number." Nathan didn't argue. With measured calm, he reached into his jacket pocket and handed her the boarding pass. Jessica flipped it over, then again, as if expecting to find some hidden flaw. She lingered on it longer than necessary, scanning every detail, stretching out the moment. Eventually, she handed it back with a huff. "Thank you." Her tone made it clear. She wasn't thanking him. She was letting him know that she still didn't approve of him being there. She turned on her heel and walked away. Across the aisle, an older woman with silver hair and kind eyes, Eleanor, gave Nathan a knowing smile. She leaned slightly toward him and whispered, "I saw what happened at the gate. Don't let it bother you." Nathan felt a flicker of gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered back, offering a small nod. The plane cruised smoothly at altitude with only minor turbulence along the way. Nathan tried to relax, closing his eyes in an attempt to rest before his long-haul shift later. But every time he drifted into a light doze, he felt it. Jessica's presence. At first, he thought he was imagining it, but every time he opened his eyes, he caught her watching him from a distance. Then, a hushed conversation near the galley reached his ears. Nathan wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but in the quiet cabin, their words carried. Jessica's voice, sharp with irritation. "I don't know why the supervisor let him sit there." Mark's response was softer, reluctant. "He has the paperwork. Not worth the trouble to argue." Jessica scoffed. "Not worth it for you, maybe. But I'm not going to be made a fool of. Let him try something. I'll be watching." Nathan's pulse quickened. She was actively looking for a reason to cause more problems for him. Why? Was it purely racism, a grudge against pilots from other airlines, or something even more personal? Whatever it wasn't rational. Nathan knew the best course of action: stay calm, document everything, and refuse to engage. Soon, Margaret returned, moving down the first-class cabin with a soft smile as she took meal orders. She reached Nathan's row. "Would you like chicken or pasta for lunch, Mr. Cole?" Nathan kept his voice polite. "Chicken, please." She jotted it down, then hesitated for a second before speaking again. Her voice gentle but laced with quiet meaning. "I'm sorry if this flight hasn't been a pleasant experience. I hope the rest is smoother." Nathan immediately understood. Margaret couldn't come right out and say it, but she saw what was happening. She knew. Nathan met her eyes and offered a small, grateful nod. "I appreciate that." She moved on, continuing her rounds, while Nathan sat back and exhaled. At least one crew member had a sense of decency. But as Jessica loomed in the background, watching his every move, Nathan knew this was far from over. Nathan took a slow breath, centering himself. Despite Margaret's quiet support, the tension still clung to him like static. The best thing he could do now was remain professional and document everything. Jessica had made her hostility clear. and he wasn't about to let her get away with it. But before he could fully settle, Jessica reappeared, this time with a tray of drinks. Her expression was colder than before. She placed a glass of water in front of the passenger in seat 1B without a word, then turned abruptly toward Nathan. But she didn't hand him anything. Nathan raised a hand slightly, indicating that he was fine. Jessica ignored the gesture and instead fixed him with an icy stare. "Everything okay here?" she asked, her tone laced with challenge. Nathan met her gaze without flinching. "All good." She lingered for a moment as if waiting for a different answer. When none came, she turned on her heel and continued down the aisle. Nathan exhaled, closing his eyes for a moment. He wished he could disappear, that the flight would just end already. But somehow, he felt even more visible. Jessica wouldn't let him fade into the background. And now, he was sure of one thing. She was keeping tabs on him. Nathan made a mental note of every interaction, every remark, every moment she treated him differently than the other passengers. If this escalated, he would need a record of everything. Lunch arrived, served by Margaret. The food was standard airline fare, chicken with steamed vegetables, but Nathan barely tasted it. His thoughts swirled with questions. Was there some deeper reason behind Jessica's hostility, or was it as simple and ugly as it seemed? Did she see a black pilot in first class and decide he didn't belong? The weight of that possibility settled in his chest. After lunch, some passengers dozed off, while others busied themselves with in-flight entertainment. Nathan tried to rest, but he couldn't fully relax. Every so often, he felt the weight of a gaze, and when he cracked his eyes open, he'd find Jessica watching him from across the cabin. He thought of the industry contacts in his phone, people who would be horrified to hear about what was happening. People who had influence. Eventually, the captain's voice crackled over the speakers, announcing their descent. The flight attendants rushed to prepare the cabin, moving with practiced efficiency. But Jessica? She wasn't focused on landing procedures. She was focused on him. Nathan noticed how her expression darkened, how she kept glancing at his seat as if she were waiting for something to happen. Or maybe, waiting for an excuse. The aircraft touched down smoothly, the wheels rolling along the runway before taxiing toward the gate. Nathan felt a wave of relief. The flight was over. Or so he thought. As soon as the seatbelt sign switched off, Jessica stepped forward, positioning herself near his row. Her stance was deliberate, as if she were blocking his path. Her voice rang out, loud enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear. "Sir, I need you to remain seated until everyone else has deplaned." Nathan's eyes narrowed. "Why?" Jessica's lips curled into a smirk. "It's a private matter." A chill ran through the cabin. Passengers exchanged glances. Across the aisle, Eleanor, the older woman who had witnessed everything, looked outraged. Another passenger shook his head in disbelief. Nathan refused to take the bait. With careful calm, he simply said, "All right." Passengers filed out, collecting luggage and moving toward the exit. Some shot him sympathetic looks, clearly sensing the injustice of the situation. Margaret hovered nearby, her discomfort obvious. Mark busied himself with the cabin door, avoiding eye contact. Finally, as the last passenger exited, Nathan rose from his seat, retrieving his carry-on from the overhead bin. Jessica stood firm, arms crossed. "All right," Nathan said evenly. "I stayed behind. What do you need to discuss?" Jessica's eyes gleamed with triumph. "I want an explanation for how you ended up here." Nathan's jaw tightened. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," she said, folding her arms. "I want to know why you think you have the right to sit in first class." A stunned silence filled the cabin. Margaret stepped forward immediately, clearing her throat. "Jessica, let's not do this." Jessica shot her a glare. "Stay out of it." Nathan took a slow breath, keeping his voice steady. "I already provided my documentation. The supervisor approved my seat. There's nothing more to discuss." Jessica scoffed. "That supervisor was clueless. I believe you pulled some strings. I don't know who you think you are, but if you're misrepresenting yourself as a pilot," Nathan's patience snapped. His voice was quiet but firm. "I'm not misrepresenting anything." Jessica lifted her chin defiantly. "Then explain yourself." Margaret moved closer, placing a hand on Jessica's arm. "That's enough. You're out of line. He has every right to be here. The flight is over." Jessica jerked her arm away. "Don't touch me," she snapped. "I'm doing my job." Nathan had had enough. He pulled out his phone. I'll be contacting customer relations. If you need verification, I can also call my airline's scheduling department. They'll confirm everything." Jessica's face twisted with hostility. For a second, Nathan thought she might physically block him from leaving, but then something in her expression shifted, a flicker of uncertainty. Slowly, she stepped aside, though her glare never wavered. Nathan didn't hesitate. He walked past her without another word, heading for the exit. Margaret trailed behind him, watchful and ready to step in. As Nathan stepped into the jet bridge, he took a slow, measured breath. This wasn't over. But now, he was going to make sure the right people heard about it. Nathan stepped off the plane, his steps measured and deliberate. At the aircraft doorway, Mark stood awkwardly, shifting his weight from foot to foot. He wouldn't meet Nathan's eyes. Nathan gave him a curt nod and continued up the jet bridge, determined to put space between himself and the tension that had followed him through the entire flight. At the end of the jet bridge, a gate agent looked up, her eyes widening slightly when she saw Nathan's tense expression. "Can I help you, sir?" Nathan kept his voice steady. "Could you direct me to the airline lounge?" She quickly pointed to the right, just down that corridor. Nathan nodded his thanks and walked away, unbuttoning the top of his shirt to loosen his tie. His heart was still pounding, not with fear, but with frustration. Inside the quiet lounge, he found a secluded corner and sank into a chair. He needed to call his airline, not only to confirm his arrival, but also to inform them that his much-needed rest had been compromised. As he reached for his phone, he realized his hands were trembling slightly. The mix of exhaustion and emotional strain had rattled him more than he wanted to admit. He took a slow breath, steadied himself, and dialed. After a few rings, a crisp professional voice answered. "Pilot scheduling, this is Rachel." "Hi, this is Nathan Cole, employee number 65249. I've arrived in Chicago as scheduled for my transatlantic flight tonight, but I need to report an incident for my inbound flight." He kept his tone measured as he recounted the details. The denied boarding, the open hostility, the attempt to detain him after landing. Rachel's voice sharpened with concern. "Nathan, that's completely unacceptable. Are you all right?" He ran a hand over his face. "I'm fine, just a bit shaken. I'll be ready for my flight, but I want this documented. That crew member's behavior was out of line." "Understood," Rachel said firmly. "Do you want to escalate this to management now, or would you prefer to handle it after your flight?" Nathan considered. "After," he decided. "I don't want this distracting me before a long-haul flight. Just make a note that I'll be following up." "Of course. Take your time. Get some rest. We need you at your best tonight." Nathan thanked her and ended the call. A wave of relief settled over him. At least his own airline had his back. Leaning back, he closed his eyes, willing himself to let go of the tension. His flight wasn't for a few hours, and he debated booking a hotel room for a nap. But the frustration and injustice wouldn't let him rest. Because it wasn't just about him. If Jessica had treated him this way, what was stopping her from doing it to another passenger? Someone without a pilot's credentials or an airline backing them up? The thought made his frustration deepen. He didn't want to pick a fight, but he felt a responsibility to hold her accountable. Just then, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Hello, Mr. Cole. This is Margaret from your flight. I hope I'm not intruding. I just wanted to apologize again for what happened. I found your number through the flight roster. If you need a statement from me or anything else, let me know." Nathan's chest tightened with gratitude. He quickly typed back, "Thank you, Margaret. I truly appreciate your kindness. I might need your testimony if I file a complaint." Her reply came almost instantly. "Of course. I'm here to help." Nathan set his phone down, feeling a sense of calm for the first time all day. At least one person had stepped forward. He spent the next hour methodically noting key details, ensuring he wouldn't forget anything important when he spoke to management. That sense of control helped him regain his composure. Finally, it was time to report to the crew lounge for his transatlantic assignment. As soon as he entered, the shift in energy was immediate. The familiar camaraderie of pilots and crew, the efficient chatter of flight planning, it reminded him of why he loved this job. He checked in with the other pilots, reviewed weather conditions, and ensured that all flight logs were in order. The routine steadied him. During the pre-flight briefing, a young first officer named Daniel turned to him. "Captain Cole, did you fly in from another city today?" Nathan nodded. "Yeah, just a short hop earlier. Glad to be here on time." He didn't elaborate. The flight to London was smooth. Nathan guided the plane through the night sky, the cockpit instruments glowing softly. The hum of the engines, the quiet confidence of the flight deck, it all reminded him of why he had chosen this path. Flying had always been about freedom, about defying limits. And tonight, as he soared across the Atlantic, he refused to let one person's prejudice clip his wings. The next day, back at his airline's headquarters, Nathan requested a meeting with his direct manager. Rachel Carter was a poised, no-nonsense woman in her 50s with a reputation for fairness and efficiency. She had an open-door policy, and Nathan knew she would take this seriously. Standing outside her office, he took a deep breath and knocked softly. "Come in," Rachel's voice called. Nathan stepped inside. She set aside a stack of paperwork and gave him a welcoming but curious look. "Nathan, how was your flight?" "The long-haul flight went well," he said. Then, with a steady gaze, he added, "But something happened on my repositioning flight and I need to talk to you about it." Rachel's brow furrowed. "Take a seat. Tell me everything." Nathan sat down, ready to make sure his voice was heard. This wasn't over yet. Rachel set aside her paperwork and leaned forward, her expression immediately shifting to one of concern. "How was your flight?" "It went well," Nathan replied, closing the door behind him. "But something happened on my repositioning flight from Houston to Chicago." Rachel's brows furrowed. "Go on." Nathan told her everything. He described the confrontation with Jessica, how she had repeatedly harassed him, how the situation escalated to her trying to keep him detained after landing. Rachel's face darkened with concern and anger. "That is entirely unacceptable." She grabbed a notepad. "Do you have the flight number and her full name?" Nathan slid his boarding pass across the desk. "Her name is Jessica Morrow. I also have a witness, Margaret, another flight attendant on that crew, who's offered to provide a statement." Rachel didn't hesitate. "I'm escalating this immediately. Would you be willing to submit a written statement?" "Absolutely," Nathan said, feeling a wave of relief. "Then do so. Send it to me as soon as you can. I'll also request Margaret's statement." She quickly jotted notes, her focus razor sharp. "I'm forwarding this to their corporate office." If that flight attendant was acting out of racial bias or simply abusing her authority, she could face serious consequences. Nathan let out a breath, feeling some of the weight lift from his shoulders. "Thank you. I didn't want to blow this out of proportion, but the way she treated me was beyond unprofessional." Rachel's voice was firm. "We have a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. That airline claims to as well. We'll see how they respond." She looked up, meeting his gaze. "I promise you, Nathan, I won't let this go unnoticed." Nathan thanked her sincerely and left the office, feeling a renewed sense of control. But the next few days brought a lingering tension. Would the other airline take this seriously, or would they try to sweep it under the rug? Nathan went about his regular flight schedule, piloting international routes while an undercurrent of anticipation followed him. Then, midweek, an email from Margaret arrived, her official witness statement. It was clear, detailed, and undeniable. She recounted how Jessica repeatedly questioned Nathan's credentials, withheld standard courtesies, and tried to intimidate him even after landing. Nathan forwarded the statement to Rachel immediately. Then, at the end of the week, his phone rang. Unknown number. He answered. A calm but authoritative voice greeted him. "Mr. Cole, this is Angela Torres from the HR department at Skyline Airways." Nathan's stomach tightened slightly. "We've reviewed the statements and spoken with the crew involved," Angela continued. "On behalf of the airline, I want to sincerely apologize for the way you were treated." Nathan remained silent, waiting for her to continue. "We take these matters very seriously. We've spoken to multiple witnesses, and we will be taking disciplinary action against the individuals responsible." Nathan exhaled slowly. He had heard apologies before, but real accountability? That was rare. "I appreciate that," he said carefully. "Can you tell me what steps you'll be taking?" Angela's voice was steady and deliberate. "I can't disclose all internal decisions, but I assure you this incident is not being ignored. We are concluding a formal review." Nathan knew corporate language well. This wasn't just damage control. It meant something serious was happening behind the scenes. Still, he remained cautiously optimistic. Talk was easy. Real action? That was harder. But the next day, an email landed in his inbox. And when he opened it, his breath caught in disbelief. Dear Mr. Cole, thank you for your patience as we reviewed the incident on Flight 739. After conducting a thorough investigation and speaking with witnesses, our management has decided to terminate the employment of the flight attendant and supporting staff who failed to uphold our standards of respect, professionalism, and compliance with airline policy. We deeply regret that you were subjected to such treatment. Nathan read the email twice, then a third time. Jessica had been fired, along with Mark and Greg, the shift supervisor who had tried to downplay the incident. Nathan leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. He had expected a suspension, maybe mandatory retraining, but terminations? The airline had wanted to make a statement. He forwarded the email to Rachel, who responded within minutes. Rachel, I'm glad they took swift action. You deserve better, Nathan. Nathan sat in silence for a long moment, looking out his window at the city lights. Part of him felt vindicated. Blatant prejudice had been met with real consequences. But another part of him felt something more complicated. Nathan had never wanted anyone to lose their job, but he also knew no one should endure what he had. The memory of flight school doubts, the sideways glances in briefing rooms, the unspoken skepticism whenever he stepped into a cockpit, it all came flooding back. This wasn't just about one flight. It was about every young pilot standing behind a chain-link fence, dreaming of the skies, wondering if they'd be allowed to belong. Days passed. Nathan poured himself into his work, piloting flights across oceans and continents. The familiar hum of the engines, the glow of the cockpit at night, the responsibility of guiding hundreds of passengers safely to their destinations, it reminded him why he fought to be here. Flying had always been about defying gravity, but for Nathan, it had also been about defying expectations. And now, he had made sure that at least one person couldn't block the path for others anymore. But the fight for fairness was far from over. The cockpit had always been Nathan's sanctuary, a place where everything made sense. That moment of liftoff when the aircraft defied gravity never lost its magic. The world stretched infinitely below, a reminder that the skies held no barriers. Up here, prejudice felt small, but on the ground, the fallout continued. Nathan hadn't spoken publicly about the incident, but someone had. An anonymous leak had exposed the firing of Jessica Morrow and her colleagues, and soon news outlets began picking up the story. Nathan's phone buzzed constantly, reporters seeking interviews, eager to turn him into the face of a wider conversation about discrimination in aviation. He declined most. He had no interest in becoming a symbol for controversy over a single ugly event. But when a respected aviation magazine reached out, he reconsidered. This wasn't about sensationalism. This was about the industry itself. And maybe, just maybe, his story could spark change. In the interview, Nathan chose his words carefully. He didn't name specific individuals. He didn't paint himself as a victim. Instead, he focused on the bigger picture. The cockpit is a place for skill and discipline, he told the journalist. Your background should never overshadow your qualifications. I hope that by addressing incidents like this, we can move closer to an aviation culture where every pilot and every passenger feels respected. The article spread quickly, resonating with pilots, flight attendants, and industry professionals worldwide. Nathan received an outpouring of support, messages from fellow pilots who had faced similar challenges, from crew members who had experienced workplace harassment, and from passengers who had witnessed discrimination firsthand. For the first time, he realized, by telling his story, he had given others a voice. A few days later, Margaret reached out. Her message was brief but unexpected. Nathan, I wanted to let you know, I resigned from Skyline Airways. After what happened, I realized I couldn't stay in that environment, but I've got a new job lined up with a regional carrier. Hope our paths cross again someday. Nathan read the message twice, a pang of guilt settling in his chest. She had done nothing wrong, and yet she had been the one to walk away. He replied immediately, I'm sorry you felt you had to leave, but I respect your decision. Wishing you all the best, Margaret. Thank you for everything. Her response was instant. It was my choice. No regrets. Take care, Captain. Nathan exhaled slowly, staring at the screen. She had stood up for what was right, and in the end, she had chosen her own peace over staying in a toxic environment. He couldn't blame her. A week later, Nathan's phone rang. His father. He smiled, picking up. "Hey, Dad." His father's deep, steady voice rumbled through the line. "Son, I saw something on the news about a pilot standing up to discrimination. That wouldn't happen to be you, would it?" Nathan chuckled, guilty as charged. His father gave a thoughtful hum. "I'm proud of you." Nathan felt his throat tighten. His father had always been a quiet pillar of strength. "I remember taking you to that old municipal airport," his father continued. "You'd press your face against the fence, watching the planes. You used to say, 'Someday, that'll be me.'" A wave of emotions swept over Nathan. "I guess I never thought about the challenges you'd face outside the cockpit." Nathan closed his eyes briefly. Neither had he. "Thanks, Dad. That means a lot." They chatted about home, the local community, and how the airport had grown since Nathan's childhood. Even in small towns, times were changing. And through it all, Nathan felt an immense gratitude for the man who had taught him perseverance. Not through loud words, but through quiet, unshakable strength. A few days later, an unexpected letter arrived. It was from Skyline Airways CEO. Nathan opened it carefully and read, "Dear Mr. Cole, I want to personally apologize for the ordeal you experienced. As CEO of our company, I take full responsibility for our employees' actions. We strive to uphold the highest standards of professionalism, and what you encountered was a clear violation of those values. While I know we cannot undo the harm that was caused, I want to assure you that we have intensified our training programs and implemented stricter anti-discrimination policies. As a gesture of goodwill, we would like to offer you a lifetime pass to fly with our airline wherever we operate in the hope that one day we may regain your trust." Nathan read the letter twice. A lifetime pass. It was an extraordinary offer, as much a PR move as it was an apology. But still, the gesture was significant. He set the letter on his coffee table, staring at it for a long moment. Would he ever actually use it? For now, he decided to let it rest. The next morning, Nathan was scheduled for a flight to the West Coast. At the airport, he moved through security, greeted his airline staff at check-in, and felt something shift inside him. The sense of belonging that Jessica had tried to strip away, it was still there. Because he had earned his place in the skies. And nothing, no person, no prejudice, no moment of injustice, could take that from him. As Nathan walked through the terminal, he noticed something. People recognized him. Some offered him polite nods, small gestures of silent support. Others simply watched curiously, connecting him to the story that had made headlines. Nathan kept his stride steady, purposeful. He hadn't sought recognition, only fairness. Inside the cockpit, he felt at home. Beside him, his co-pilot ran through the final pre-flight checks. Nathan double-checked everything, ensuring that every system was in place, every protocol followed. As the plane roared down the runway, he felt the same thrill he always did. That moment when the aircraft broke free from the earth, defying gravity, carrying hundreds of lives toward distant destinations. Here, skill mattered. Precision mattered. Calm under pressure mattered. But prejudice? It had no place at 35,000 feet. Hours later, after a smooth landing on the West Coast, Nathan emerged from the cockpit and stood by the flight deck door, greeting passengers as they exited. A well-dressed, older black gentleman paused, looking at him with a knowing smile. "I read up you," he said quietly. "Thank you for what you did." Nathan met his gaze. "I appreciate that, sir." The man hesitated, then added, "My grandson wants to be a pilot. It's good to see someone who looks like him up front." A warmth spread through Nathan's chest. "Tell him he can do anything he sets his mind to." The man's eyes sparkled. "I will." And then he was gone, disappearing into the flow of travelers. But that single moment stayed with Nathan, a reminder that this was about more than just one flight, one confrontation, one unfair moment. It was about visibility, representation, possibility. Later that night, back in his hotel room, Nathan found himself thinking about everything that had led to this moment. One call to the right person, the support of his manager, Margaret's witness statement. Each piece had added up, leading to real consequences. A story had been told, a conversation had begun. And the aviation industry? It was listening. As much as Nathan tried to move forward, part of him still wondered about Jessica. Had she learned anything from this? Did she understand what she had lost because of her own actions? Or did she blame him entirely? Nathan would probably never know. He wished her no ill will, but he was relieved that her ability to undermine, question, and block others from opportunities had come to an end. On his next flight, as the aircraft cruised smoothly above the clouds, Nathan took a moment to sip his coffee. He let his mind drift back to the events that had unfolded so quickly. How swiftly justice had arrived once the right people heard about it. Pilots often talked about situational awareness, the ability to process all relevant factors to ensure a safe flight. But in life, Nathan realized, situational awareness also meant recognizing injustice and having the courage to push back against it. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. A week later, Nathan found himself back in Chicago for another set of flights. During a layover, he took a slow walk through the same terminal where it had all happened. The memory hit him sharply. But this time, there was no tension, no anxiety. Instead, the corridor felt open and bright, filled with the hum of travelers from all walks of life. He paused near the gate where the confrontation had unfolded. Passengers lined up as usual, handing their boarding passes to a new team of flight attendants, professionals who greeted them with smiles instead of suspicion. Nathan caught no trace of the tension that once loomed. Quietly, he lifted his pilot's cap in a small symbolic salute, not to the place itself, but to what it represented now, a piece of history he had reclaimed. Then, with a deep breath, he adjusted his cap and walked away, blending into the steady current of travelers. The future felt wide open, as boundless as the sky itself. In the months that followed, Nathan continued to thrive in his career. His experience, his steady leadership, and his resilience led to a promotion, earning him a position as a higher-ranking captain on more prestigious routes. Every new flight reminded him why he loved this job. The discipline, the wonder, the camaraderie. And he stayed in touch with Margaret, who was flourishing in her new role. One day, she sent him a message. "Nathan, I just wanted to say, thank you. Your complaint didn't just change my career, it opened my eyes to what real professionalism looks like. I always wanted to stand up for what was right. But seeing you do it so calmly and effectively, it gave me the courage to walk away from an environment that tolerated prejudice." Nathan smiled at the message, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. As time passed, the entire experience became just one chapter in Nathan's broader life story. A chapter that proved adversity could pave the way for awareness and change, and he made sure to pass that lesson forward. Once a month, he volunteered at a pilot outreach program for young aviation enthusiasts. He stood in front of classrooms filled with wide-eyed kids, eager to learn about flying. He told them about flight school, about overcoming doubt, about the hard work it took to make it in the industry. And yes, sometimes he shared the story of the injustice he had faced. Not to dwell on it, but to remind them of this simple truth. The sky is open to all. You just have to believe in your abilities and stand firm when someone tries to clip your wings. And as he looked into their hopeful faces, Nathan knew that was the real victory. One early morning, just before his flight to Tokyo, Nathan found himself in the crew lounge, sipping coffee and flipping through flight plans. Across the room, a group of new flight attendants huddled over their training manuals, prepping for their first international assignment. He recognized that spark in their eyes, the same excitement he had felt at the beginning of his career. One of them, a bright-eyed recruit named Isabella, glanced up and caught sight of Nathan's captain's stripes. Her eyes widened with recognition. "Captain Cole," she said, "I read about you in an article. You're the pilot who stood up to discrimination on that other airline, right?" Nathan blinked, momentarily surprised, but then he offered a respectful nod. "That was me." Isabella smiled broadly. "Reading about you made me realize how important it is to speak up. My cousin faced something similar, and we were too scared to file a complaint. But after seeing what you did, we filed it together." Nathan felt the words settle deep in his chest. Humbled, he said, "I'm glad you did. Sometimes it just takes one story to inspire others." She nodded, her determination shining through. "Thank you, Captain." Nathan smiled. "No need to thank me. Just pay it forward." Moments like this affirmed something for Nathan. His experience wasn't just an isolated event. It had rippled outward, encouraging others to refuse silent acceptance of discrimination. The memory of Jessica's furious glare no longer held weight in his mind. Instead, it was replaced by the determination in the eyes of a new generation of aviation professionals, one that was ready to uphold respect, equality, and fairness. Over the next year, Nathan's career soared onward. He crisscrossed continents, touching down in cities he had once only dreamed of visiting as a boy standing behind an airport fence. And with each flight, he reminded himself, the journey to a fairer world is ongoing, but every step mattered. Every conversation mattered. Every flight mattered. And just as his plane overcame turbulence to find smooth air, Nathan trusted that, despite the challenges of discrimination, the path ahead would always lead to progress. One day, Nathan realized he had fully made peace with what had happened. Not because Jessica and her enablers were fired, but because he had done the right thing. He had stood firm, he had documented the facts, he had trusted the power of truth, and the industry had listened. The message had been clear. The aviation world would not condone discrimination. Nathan continued doing what he did best: flying planes, mentoring young pilots, encouraging others to break barriers in the sky. Because in the end, it wasn't about revenge. It was about integrity. And that was a lesson he would carry forever. Nathan had once been denied a first-class seat by a prejudiced flight attendant, but with one decisive call and the courage to stand up for himself, he helped ensure that the hateful ignorance displayed that day would be grounded permanently. And as he looked toward the horizon, he knew it would always remain open and bright, because dignity has no assigned seats. It belongs to everyone who dares to dream.